March 23, 1943. El Guetar Valley, Tunisia. The wind carried the smell of diesel and cordite across the olive groves. American infantry of the 1st Division, the Big Red One, lay sprawled along a shallow ridge, eyes fixed on the German armor rolling through the valley below. The sun shimmered on the dunes, and the air trembled with the clank of treads. Private Joseph Mallory, 23, from Indiana, checked the weight of his rifle, an M1 Garand, olive wood polished from sand and sweat. Beside him, Sergeant Don Carver muttered, "Keep it low, kid, Tiger's up front." At 800 yards, the German tanks began to fan out. Behind them, waves of infantry advanced, Mauser 98K rifles glinting under the desert Sunday. Each German soldier fired, worked the bolt, fired again, a rhythm drilled into them since Poland. To them, these Americans were green boys armed with a semi-automatic toy. That's what their officers had told them. Die Amerikaner und ihre Maschinengewehre Spielzeug. But as the Germans advanced, a new rhythm answered back, rapid, unbroken, unnervingly steady. Crack, 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 crack. Mallory squeezed the trigger, 4 shots in as many seconds. The Garand bucked gently against his shoulder, smoother than any bolt action he'd trained against in basic. Around him, dozens of rifles fired in overlapping volleys, creating a continuous wall of gunfire that echoed off the rocks like machine guns. German officers dropped mid-command. A second wave tried to crawl forward and fell again. Sergeant Carver's voice rose over the chaos. "Keep 'em coming. Don't let 'em breathe." The M1s spat brass and smoke. In less than 5 minutes, what the Germans had mocked as a toy had cut entire platoons to pieces. The survivors hesitated, unsure what they were facing: Americans with automatics, machine guns in every trench. By noon, the valley was littered with gray uniforms and shattered helmets. German prisoners would later tell interrogators, "Your men fired like devils." There was no pause, no chance to move. For the first time, the Wehrmacht realized they were up against an army whose basic rifle could pour out fire like a squad weapon. The myth of the toy rifle died that day in the dust of Tunisia. As night fell, Mallory sat cleaning his Garand, sand crunching in his teeth. He ran his finger along the stock, whispered quietly, "Not bad for a toy." Springfield, Massachusetts, January 9th, 1936. Snow blanketed the courtyard of the U.S. Army's Springfield Armory. Inside, under the glow of fluorescent lamps and the metallic hum of machinery, an unassuming Canadian-born engineer named John Cantius Garand stood before a line of generals. His latest prototype rested on a workbench draped with Army-issue canvas, a weapon that would soon change modern warfare. "Gentlemen," Garand said softly, his French-Canadian accent still faint despite decades in the States. "This rifle loads itself." One of the officers frowned. "You mean to tell us, Mr. Garand, that a soldier can fire 8 rounds without cycling the bolt?" Garand nodded. "Yes, sir. Gas-operated. It reloads automatically after each shot." There was a pause, disbelief, and curiosity wrestling in the air. For half a century, soldiers around the world had lived and died by the rhythm of bolt-action rifles. One shot, then a pause, then another. From the German Mauser 98K to the British Lee Enfield, this was gospel. A self-loading rifle was either too heavy, too fragile, or too complicated. But Garand's design was different. Inside its walnut stock was a piston-driven system that tapped off a bit of the gun's own energy to cycle the next round smooth, reliable, and precise. The weapon was balanced, solid, and fired the 30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same deadly round used by American machine guns. Colonel Stanley Thompson leaned forward, curiosity gleaming. "Show us, Mr. Garand." Garand inserted the N-block click, and raised the rifle to his shoulder. The officers leaned in. Crack, 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 crack. 8 rounds in less than 5 seconds. The distinctive metallic ping as the clip ejected echoed through the firing hall. Silence followed except for the faint whine of the ventilation fans. Thompson broke it first. Good God. In that moment, the M1 Garand was born, officially adopted as the U.S. rifle caliber 30 M1. Garand smiled faintly. It's just engineering, gentlemen. But the road to perfection was anything but easy. Throughout the late 1930s, the rifle endured brutal trials: sand, mud, ice, and neglect. Critics within the Army Ordnance Department called it too complex, too costly, too heavy. The U.S. Marine Corps initially rejected it altogether, preferring the older, familiar M1903 Springfield. At the firing ranges of Quantico, skeptical sergeants sneered. Too many moving parts, one said. A jam waiting to happen. They were wrong, but the M1 had to prove it in blood. By 1941, war clouds gathered over the Pacific. Franklin Roosevelt had already declared the United States the arsenal of democracy. Production at Springfield Armory in Winchester shifted into overdrive. Workers, men and women alike, stood shoulder to shoulder along the assembly lines, riveters and machinists turning out rifles by the hundreds each day. A machinist named Helen Murphy later recalled, "We didn't think of it as making rifles. We thought of it as making sons' lives a little longer." Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. When news of the attack broke, Springfield Armory's night shift kept working without orders. Men bolted parts in silence. The clang of steel became a kind of prayer. Within days, thousands of Garands were shipped to the Pacific, into the hands of soldiers who had never fired one before. In the training fields of Fort Benning, Georgia, instructors watched in awe as new recruits mastered the M1 in hours. Its semi-automatic action meant even inexperienced men could put accurate fire downrange quickly. Sergeant James "Red" McKenzie, a veteran of the old Springfield bolt rifle, summed it up perfectly. "This thing makes every man a machine gun." Across the ocean, the German Wehrmacht was expanding across Europe armed with Mauser rifles built on 19th century principles. They had discipline, precision, and experience. But soon, they would face something different. An army where every rifleman fired almost twice as fast, and every squad poured out a storm of lead. Hitler's intelligence services took note. Reports from North Africa began filtering back in 1942 strange, semi-automatic rifles in the hands of American infantry. The term Selbstladegewehr appeared in the reports, usually with skepticism attached. One Wehrmacht technical officer wrote, "Americans appear to be equipping troops with automatic rifles. It cannot be reliable. Wasteful of ammunition." They laughed the way traditionalists always laugh at revolution. But in the sands of Tunisia, on a March morning in 1943, those same officers would realize that this waste of ammunition meant something terrifyingly new. A rifleman who could fire again and again without pause and change the balance of infantry combat forever. As the snow melted outside Springfield that spring, production ramped higher still. The numbers told the story. By 1943, more than 1 million Garands were in the hands of American soldiers. In quiet moments between test firings, John Garand would sometimes walk through the factory, listening to the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal. Workers said he rarely smiled. But when he did, it was when he heard the distinctive ping of an ejected clip echo through the test range. He never sought fame or fortune. When asked later why he never patented the design for personal gain, he simply said, "I belong to the government. The rifle belongs to the soldier." Outside, the world was burning. And soon, that soldier armed with the Garand would meet the enemy face to face across the deserts of Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy, and the frozen forests of Belgium. The rifle that loaded itself was ready for war. March 23 RD 1943. El Guetar, Tunisia. The dawn broke over the desert with the harsh brilliance only North Africa could conjure, a pale, white light that made every grain of sand shimmer like glass. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, crouched behind low dunes, watching the horizon. From the east came the sound they dreaded most, the heavy growl of panzers. Private Joseph Mallory shifted his helmet and wiped the sweat from his eyes. It wasn't fear that made his hands shake. It was the waiting, the silence before the storm. Beside him, Corporal Eddie Carver, his sergeant's kid brother, peered through binoculars. "Panzer IVs, he muttered, "and a lot of them." The Americans had fought Germans before at Kasserine, disastrously. They'd learned the hard way that experience meant everything. The Germans were veterans, hardened by years in Poland, France, and Russia. Their tactics were precise, their confidence absolute. And they believed these new Americans, armed with clumsy semi-automatics, were soft. At 0800, the first German shells slammed into the ridge. The ground shook like thunder. Shards of sand and rock peppered Mallory's face as he pressed himself into the dirt. A second barrage followed, walking fire across the valley. "Hold your fire," shouted Captain Edward McGee over the din. "Let him come." Through the smoke, the German infantry advanced gray ghosts in perfect formation, rifles gleaming. They fired methodically, working their bolts with mechanical precision. Crack, click, crack, click. Then came the American reply. A single sharp volley cracked out from the ridge, then another, faster. Within seconds, the air was filled with the continuous roar of M1 Garands. Crack, 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 crack. The distinct metallic ping of ejected clips rang like tiny church bells in the chaos. The Germans froze. It wasn't the volume of fire that startled them. It was the consistency. There were no pauses, no breaks to reload. The Americans fired again and again, rifles spitting brass into the sand. To the Germans' ears, it sounded like 100 light machine guns had opened up at once. An Oberleutnant shouted, "Sie haben automatische Gewehre." "They have automatic rifles." Mallory took careful aim and dropped 2 men in quick succession. His rifle's smooth action gave him rhythm, confidence. He didn't need to look away or break motion to chamber another round. Every squeeze of the trigger was met with a clean recoil and instant readiness for the next shot. Carver slapped him on the shoulder. "See that, Joe? They can't handle it. They thought we were green." A German machine gun barked from the left flank, tracers whipping over the ridge. Mallory ducked, dirt spraying his face. He rolled, shouldered the Garand, and fired 3 shots in a heartbeat. The gunner slumped over his weapon. Down the line, squads were doing the same coordinated chaos, fueled by training and instinct. The Garand's 8-round clips meant no soldier was ever completely silent for long. When one man reloaded, another was firing. In under 20 minutes, the valley floor was strewn with bodies. The German assault faltered, then broke. Those who survived dove for cover behind their own smoking tanks. At Battalion HQ, a captured German sergeant spat blood into the sand as he was questioned. "What happened to your advance?" asked Lieutenant Tom Reeves, a young intelligence officer. The prisoner scowled. "Your men, they shoot like machines, always shooting, always." Reeves wrote that line down. Later, it would appear in an official U.S. Army report. German forces expressed shock at the high rate of sustained rifle fire from U.S. infantry equipped with the M1. In the days that followed, rumors spread through German ranks. Some believed the Americans carried submachine guns. Others thought the U.S. had issued automatic rifles to every man, a logistical impossibility by their standards. But whatever they called it, they knew one thing. The Americans could lay down a storm of lead without waiting for orders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, took notice. In his diary, he later noted the ferocity of American rifle fire at El Getar. His Africa Corps had faced British Enfields, Russian Mosins, and French Lebels, but nothing like the M1 Garand. That day, the myth of the clumsy semi-automatic died in the desert. Night settled cold and silent over the battlefield. The stars above Tunisia were sharp as blades. Mallory sat cleaning his Garand by lantern light, the metal still warm from hours of combat. He ran his thumb along the receiver, feeling the faint engraving. U.S. Rifle, Calatoele, 30. M1 Springfield Armory. Carver dropped beside him, lighting a cigarette. "Hell of a day," he said. Mallory nodded. They thought it was a toy. Carver grinned. "Guess we showed 'em." Mallory looked out over the dark valley flickers of burning wrecks, painting the sand red. The air still smelled of cordite and oil. For the first time since shipping out, he believed they could win. Because this rifle, this machine of walnut and steel, had given them something the Germans couldn't match: the ability to fight without fear of falling behind. A week later, Allied correspondents in North Africa began filing their reports. 1. embedded with the big red one, wrote, "The new American rifle is a marvel. It spits fire as fast as you can squeeze. The Germans who once mocked it now lie defeated by it." When the story reached the States, the public finally began to hear about the M1 Garand. But few understood what it truly meant, that for the first time in modern history, the ordinary soldier carried a weapon that gave him an edge, not in courage or numbers, but in speed, precision, and relentless firepower. Back in Springfield, John Garand read the reports quietly in his office. He set them down without comment, only whispering to a colleague, "It's working. That's all that matters." The rifle that had once been dismissed as a mechanical curiosity had now proven itself in the crucible of battle, and it was only the beginning. Soon, the M1 Garand would leave the sands of North Africa for the cliffs of Sicily, the fields of Normandy, and the frozen hell of Bastogne, turning the tide of war one trigger pull at a time. July 10th, 1943, dawn over the Mediterranean. The sea was a sheet of molten silver as the Allied invasion fleet rolled toward the coast of Sicily. Battleships loomed like mountains on the horizon, their guns flashing in rhythmic thunder. The invasion Operation Husky was underway. Inside a landing craft, Sergeant Don Carver and his squad huddled shoulder to shoulder, helmets clanking, sea spray stinging their faces. The air reeked of salt and fear. Each man clutched his M1 Garand like a lifeline. Carver looked down at the weapon resting across his knees. The walnut stock was scarred and darkened by the desert sand of Tunisia, but it still gleamed faintly in the early light. 8 rounds per clip, gas-operated, smooth as silk. He'd come to trust it more than anything. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. The ramp crashed down, and the world exploded. Machine gun fire shredded the surf. Men dove into the water, shouting, stumbling, falling. Carver hit the beach hard, his boots sinking into wet sand as tracers hissed overhead. The smell of cordite filled his lungs. Ahead, pillboxes spat fire from the ridgeline. The Germans had dug in deep, and the beach was a killing zone. Carver dropped behind a dune and shouted to Mallory, "On me! Garand's up!" They rose together, 2 silhouettes against chaos, and opened fire. Crack, 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 crack. The Garands sang their deadly chorus, bullets hammering into the pillbox slits. The men could see sparks dancing off the concrete. A German gunner toppled backward, his MG-34 falling silent. "Move! Move!" Carver yelled. The Americans surged forward, ducking behind craters and burning jeeps. The rhythm of the battle was unlike anything in Europe, so far, fast, unrelenting, close. The Garand gave them confidence. It let them fire, move, and fire again without breaking stride. The difference was psychological as much as physical. Across the ridge, German defenders' men from the Hermann Göring Division struggled to keep pace. Used to fighting opponents with bolt-action rifles, they found themselves outgunned by infantrymen who fired like light machine gunners. Every time they raised their Mausers, another burst of semi-automatic fire pinned them back. One German corporal shouted in disbelief, "Sie schießen ohne Pause." They shoot without stopping. By mid-afternoon, the Americans had pushed inland. The heat was brutal. Dust clung to sweat and gun oil. Carver's squad advanced through the orchards, the faint hum of insects almost masking distant artillery. In a dry creek bed, they found a group of German prisoners, hands up, faces streaked with grime. Among them was a young officer, perhaps 23, his gray tunic torn and sun-bleached. His English was halting, but his curiosity was clear. He gestured toward Carver's rifle. "This, your gun, it shoots. Fast, always fast." Carver raised an eyebrow, handed it over. The German took it gingerly, inspecting the action. He tried to pull the bolt manually and flinched when it slammed forward under spring pressure. He muttered almost to himself, "2. Perfect." Carver just smiled. "That's what we call progress." The officer handed it back with a slow nod. "If we had these," he said quietly, "maybe Russia would be over." The battles for Sicily dragged on for weeks. Hills, vineyards, and narrow mountain passes fought over inch by inch. The Garand proved its worth every day. In close combat, Its 8-round clip was fast enough to outshoot the Mauser, but powerful enough to drop a man with a single well-placed shot. The rifle's gas system held up under dust, heat, and rain. Soldiers discovered they could fire hundreds of rounds a day without serious fouling. And when the inevitable jam came, a grain of sand in the chamber or a dented clip, the fix was simple. A swift pull of the operating rod, a slap, and the rifle was ready again. For the men on the ground, the M1 wasn't just a tool. It was insurance, the difference between surviving an ambush and dying behind a bolt handle. As the Americans drove the Germans and Italians north, the rifle's reputation spread. British observers attached to U.S. units sent back glowing reports to London. One wrote, "The American rifleman possesses firepower unheard of in infantry engagements. A section of Garand, equipped soldiers, can suppress positions typically requiring machine guns." Across the lines, German command noted the same with concern. An internal report from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, in late 1943 stated, "Enemy infantry enjoys high individual fire density due to semi-automatic rifles, tactical implications significant." Hitler himself, always obsessed with weaponry, demanded updates on the American self-loader. But Germany was already stretched thin, its industry crippled by Allied bombing, its engineers busy with wonder weapons. Projects like the Gewehr 41 and later the St. G 44 aimed to close the gap, but they came too late and in too few numbers. Meanwhile, American factories were turning out 5,000 Garands a day. By the time Sicily fell in August 1943, the lesson was clear. The rifle that had once been doubted now defined the American soldier. In the shattered streets of Palermo, Carver's squad finally rested. Mallory leaned against a wall, reloading an en-bloc clip with practiced ease. "Click. That sound," he said. "I swear I'll hear it in my sleep." Carver grinned, flicking his cigarette into the rubble. "Better that than the sound of a bolt you didn't have time to pull." A truck rolled past, loaded with captured weapons, Italian Carcanos, German Mausers, even a few MP-40s. None of them felt as solid, as simple, or as inevitable as the Garand resting in Carver's lap. The war was moving north, toward Europe's heart, and the rifle that loaded itself would be there for every step from Sicily's beaches to the cliffs of Normandy. At night, on the deck of a transport bound for England, Mallory cleaned his rifle beneath the stars. The sea was calm. The sound of the metal brush on steel was rhythmic, almost meditative. He didn't know it yet, but soon that same rifle would be the first thing he'd grip when the ramps dropped on June 6th, 1944. And the Germans waiting above the beaches of France, the ones who still called it a toy, were about to learn just how wrong they were. June 6th, 1944. 5:23 du matin, Normandy, France. The world shook with thunder. From horizon to horizon, the English Channel boiled with ships, destroyers, transports, landing craft, more vessels than any man had ever seen. The gray dawn flickered with muzzle flashes as Allied warships unleashed the heaviest naval bombardment in history. In one of those heaving landing craft, Private Joseph Mallory stood knee-deep in icy water. His knuckles whitened on the stock of his M1 Garand. Rain and sea spray mixed with fear on his face. Around him, 30 men waited silent, pale, eyes locked forward. The coxswain shouted over the roar, "Omaha Beach!" Then the whistle. The ramp slammed down. Machine gun fire ripped across the surf. Men fell instantly, waves turning red. Mallory stumbled into the freezing water, struggling for footing under the weight of his pack. Bullets hissed around him like hornets. He dragged himself behind a steel obstacle and gasped for breath. The sound was like nothing human, a chaos of screams, explosions, and the constant metallic snapping of bullets on iron. The Garand felt heavy and cold in his hands. He wiped the water from the sights, chambered around, and looked up the beach. Pinned American soldiers lay everywhere. The sand was alive with fire. MG, 42 seconds from the bluffs above, cut down anything that moved. And then training took over. Mallory pressed his cheek to the stock and aimed at the bunker slit. The recoil came smooth and sharp. Crack, crack, crack. 4 rounds in seconds. The German gunner dropped, replaced instantly by another. Mallory fired again. The Garand's semi-automatic rhythm echoed like a heartbeat amid the chaos. "Keep firing!" screamed Lieutenant Reeves, sprinting between obstacles. "Lay it on 'em, boys!" All along the beach, that sound grew thousands of Garands, spitting fire in steady, overlapping waves. What had begun as chaos began to turn into pressure. The German defenders, stunned by the volume, ducked back inside their bunkers. The Americans surged forward. For the first time in the invasion, speed belonged to the riflemen. Up on the bluffs, Oberfeldwebel Hans Kruger peered through his binoculars. The Americans were supposed to be pinned down, helpless. But these soldiers, these kids, were firing faster than he'd ever seen. He turned to his corporal. "They don't reload," he muttered, disbelief in his voice. "They just keep shooting." The corporal frowned. "They're machines." Kruger adjusted his scope again and saw the truth. Each man carried a strange rifle, thick-barreled, boxy, with an N-block clip that sprang free after every burst. He'd read about it in reports from Africa and Sicily. The Selbstladegewehr, M1. He whispered it under his breath like a curse. Garand. By mid-morning, the first Americans reached the seawall. Mallory dove behind it, chest heaving. He popped the empty clip, slammed in another ping. Click, ready. The motion was muscle memory now, a reflex. Beside him, Corporal Carver was grinning despite the smoke. "Fastest damn reload in the world," he said, patting his rifle. "You hear that ping? That's music." Mallory smirked. To them, it's death. Above, naval shells screamed overhead, pulverizing the ridge. The earth trembled. Dust fell like ash. At 0930, a squad of engineers blew a breach in the wire. Mallory's unit charged through. The sound of Garands filled the air again, a relentless chorus of semi-automatic thunder. Crack, crack, crack. A German machine gunner went down. Crack, crack. Another fell from the trench. The Germans fired back desperately. Bolts clattering, Mausers cycling, but the rhythm was wrong, too slow. Every time a German paused to reload, an American didn't. It wasn't just a difference in firepower. It was a difference in momentum. By noon, the beachhead was secure. The stars and stripes waved atop the bluffs where German bunkers once stood. Smoke drifted over the sand, and the moans of the wounded mixed with the crash of waves. Mallory sat in a crater, staring at his rifle. The barrel was warm, the wood blackened where his hands had gripped it. He'd fired over 200 rounds that day, and it still worked as if new. Nearby, a medic knelt beside a wounded German officer. The man, pale and bloodied, gestured weakly toward Mallory's rifle. "That gun," he rasped in broken English. "We thought it was rumor." Mallory looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. Not anymore. That night, around a small fire inland, the men cleaned their weapons in silence. Every scratch, every burn mark told the story of survival. The Garand wasn't just a rifle, it had been their salvation. Captain McGee walked among them, hands behind his back. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "today you proved something the world will never forget. Every man with a Garand is a squad of his own." Someone laughed, weary but proud. "Then I guess we got a damn good squad." In London, General Dwight D. Eisenhower read the first superior American rifle fire. Meanwhile, across Germany, shocked reports reached the Wehrmacht High Command. Officers debated whether the Americans had somehow issued automatic weapons to every infantryman. They ordered technical evaluations of captured M1s and found, to their horror, that it wasn't fantasy. It was simple, brutal efficiency. A single soldier, armed with this rifle, could fire 40-50 aimed shots per minute, twice the rate of any bolt action in the world. When news reached John Garand back at Springfield, he read it in silence. One of his engineers, flushed with excitement, said, "They're calling it a miracle weapon, John. A miracle." Garand simply shook his head. "No," he said softly. "It's a tool. The miracle is the men who use it." In Normandy, Those men slept where they fell on the grass, in shell holes, beneath the wings of gliders and stars. The world around them smelled of smoke, oil, and earth. Mallory dreamed of the sound, the steady rhythm of the rifle that never failed him. That ping, that heartbeat. The invasion of Europe had begun, and the M1 Garand was leading it, one shot at a time. June 25, 1944, near Saint-Lô, France. The air was thick with flies and gunpowder. Normandy's hedgerows, towering green walls of ancient earth and thorn, turned every field into a fortress. It wasn't the open beach anymore. Now the war was fought at whisper distance. Private Joseph Mallory crawled through the damp soil, the smell of crushed grass heavy in his nose. His M1 Garand was slick with morning dew. Beside him, Corporal Eddie Carver whispered, "They're close. I can hear 'em talking." Somewhere ahead, through the maze of hedges, came the low clatter of Mausers and the murmur of German voices. The enemy knew these fields better than any map could show. The Americans, fresh off the beaches, were learning the hard way that every hedgerow could hide a dozen rifles. Mallory raised 2 fingers. His squad fanned out silently. He glanced at his rifle, checked the chamber loaded. 8 rounds, ready. In this terrain, that meant everything. The Garand wasn't just a rifle here. It was the difference between reacting and surviving. The first shot came from the shadow's crack. A German sniper in a farmhouse window. A bullet whined past Mallory's ear. Instinctively, he rolled, brought the rifle up, and fired twice. The muzzle flash from the window disappeared. "Go! Go!" Carver yelled. The squad burst through the hedge, shouting, firing. The Garands barked in rapid, overlapping rhythm, C-R-A-C-K, 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 C-R-A-C-K. The sound rolled through the fields like thunder. The Germans fired back, cycling their Mausers desperately, but they couldn't match the tempo. Every time they paused to reload, the Americans pressed forward. A German machine gun opened up from a barn ahead, cutting the air with a stream of tracers. Mallory hit the dirt. The rounds chewed through branches inches from his head. He waited for the pause, that half-second lull, when the gunner swapped belts, then sprinted forward. He dove behind a stone wall, breathing hard. Popping up, he aimed through a crack and fired 1, 2, 3 rounds in a single smooth motion. The gunner fell, slumping over the MG-42. Smoke curled from the Garand's barrel. By noon, the skirmish was over. The Americans had taken the farm, at a cost. Carver sat in the grass, canteen in hand, watching medics move among the wounded. His hands trembled as he reloaded a clip. Ping, click, slam. "You okay?" Mallory asked. Carver nodded. "Yeah. Just, they never stop coming." Mallory smiled weakly. "Neither do we." He looked at his rifle, the wood nicked and scarred from weeks of battle. He could still feel the vibration of every shot, the rhythm drilled into his bones. In the hedgerows, that rhythm kept them alive, steady, fast, certain. Across the lines, German commanders were growing frustrated. Reports from frontline units told the same story. American infantry advancing with unusually high rates of fire. The M1 Garand had earned a grim respect. Captured soldiers admitted to fear. One recalled, "When you fight the Americans, it feels like every man has a machine gun. You fire once, they fire 10 times." In Berlin, weapons engineers were ordered to accelerate work on Germany's own semi-automatic designs. But by mid-1944, it was too late. Production chaos, Allied bombing, and shortages meant only a handful of Guerre 43 seconds ever reached the front. Meanwhile, the Americans had nearly 3 million Garands in service. As July turned to August, the push towards Saint-Lô intensified. The fields were craters now, the hedges burned, the air heavy with the stench of death. Yet through it all, the rhythm of the Garand never stopped. Sergeant Don Carver, now leading the squad after their captain's death, often told his men, "Keep your rhythm. One breath, one trigger. That rifle won't fail you." It became almost ritualistic. Fire, move, fire again. 8 rounds, reload, keep the momentum. Even under artillery, even when nerves shook, the M1's smooth cycling gave a strange calm. During one brutal fight outside Perrier, Mallory's squad was pinned by a German counterattack. Dozens of enemy infantry advanced through the smoke. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1. Carver barked orders. Short bursts, keep the line. They fired in perfect rhythm, each man alternating reloads so someone was always firing. The Garands roared, brass flying, clips pinging off the rocks. German soldiers fell in waves. After 15 minutes, the field fell silent. The counterattack had dissolved. The squad's ammo was nearly gone, but the line had held. Lieutenant Reeves radioed in later. Enemy force estimated at company strength. Repelled by one platoon. Cause of success sustained rifle fire. The official report was clinical. The truth was simpler. The Garand turned ordinary soldiers into something extraordinary. That night, under a sky streaked with tracers and smoke, Mallory sat cleaning his rifle by candlelight. He traced his finger over the engraved serial number, blackened from oil and grime. It wasn't just steel anymore, it was a part of him. Carver joined him, sitting in silence. Finally, he said, "You ever think about the guy who made it? The one who figured this out?" Mallory nodded. "Yeah, I think he saved a lot of us." Carver grinned faintly. "Then I'd buy that man a drink." In Springfield, Massachusetts, John Garand was already reading the dispatches from Normandy. His rifle had become a legend. Factories were running day and night, turning out 6,000 rifles daily. Workers wrote letters to the front, signing them simply, "Built by Springfield, come home safe." Garand himself rarely spoke publicly. But once, in an interview, he said, "A rifle's purpose isn't to glorify war. It's to end it faster, so fewer boys have to die." And in the fields of Normandy, that's exactly what his creation was doing, ending battles faster, saving lives shot by shot. As dawn broke the next day, the 1st Division prepared to push toward Coutances. The hedgerows stretched on endlessly, green and silent. The men checked their weapons, tightened straps, adjusted bayonets. Mallory loaded his last clip, the metallic ping echoing faintly in the still morning. Carver glanced over. "Ready?" Mallory nodded. "Always." He looked at the horizon, the faint line of trees, the smoke rising beyond, and shouldered his Garand. Somewhere out there, another battle waited, another field, another test. But the men who carried America's toy rifle no longer feared what was ahead. They knew exactly what that sound, that sharp, steady crack meant. It meant they'd keep moving forward. December 20th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets over the Ardennes forest. The trees stood black and skeletal against a pale sky, their branches heavy with ice. Somewhere in that white silence, the German army 200,000 strong was on the move again. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. Inside the besieged town of Bastogne, Private Joseph Mallory rubbed his gloved hands together, trying to coax warmth back into his fingers. His breath came out in white bursts. The Garand, resting across his knees, was wrapped in an old wool sock to keep frost off the action. Its metal still gleamed, stubbornly alive despite the cold. Across from him, Sergeant Don Carver crouched beside a smoldering fire, his face gaunt and pale. "No word from command," he muttered. "We're still surrounded." Mallory gave a thin smile. "So nothing's changed." Outside the foxholes, the world was frozen death trees shattered by artillery, the ground buried in snow and bodies. The 101st Airborne Division, cut off and under constant attack, held Bastogne with dwindling food, no resupply, and barely enough ammunition to fight another day. But the rifles still worked. Always the rifles. At dawn, the shelling began again. German mortars whined overhead, exploding among the ruins. Snow and dirt rained down. Mallory hunkered lower, clutching his rifle. The Garand stock was ice cold, the trigger stiff, but he kept it close, warming the mechanism with his breath. "Here they come!" someone shouted. Through the swirling snow, shapes appeared, gray uniforms advancing through the pines, moving fast, confident. They'd been told the Americans were finished, starving, frozen. They didn't expect resistance. Then the forest erupted. Dozens of M1 Garands cracked in unison, echoing through the valley like thunder in the snow. Crack, 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 crack. Mallory fired from his foxhole, his rifle kicking gently against his shoulder. Each shot found a target. The rifle didn't jam, didn't hesitate, not even in the bitter cold. The semi-automatic rhythm never broke. German soldiers dropped, stumbled, fell back in confusion. They weren't used to this, an infantry line that fired so fast, so precisely. Carver's voice rang out. Hold the line. Make every shot count. He fired again and again, steam rising from the rifle like breath from a living thing. The Garands chattered steadily, brass flying into the snow, glowing faintly before disappearing beneath white drifts. A German machine gun opened up across the road, bullets slicing the air. Carver ducked, waited for the telltale pause, then stood, aimed, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. Crack, crack, crack. The gun went silent. When the firing finally stopped, the snow was pink and the forest eerily quiet. The men reloaded in silence, their faces gray with exhaustion. Mallory wiped his rifle down with an oil rag, hands trembling from the cold. He whispered, "She still runs." Carver nodded. "Yeah, she's tougher than we are." The Garand's gas system, designed for precision and balance, had proven nearly unstoppable. In freezing mud, snow, and ice, it refused to quit. Bolt-action rifles jammed, machine guns froze solid, but the Garand kept firing. That day, it wasn't just a weapon. It was a companion, warm in the hand, fierce in the heart. As night fell, the sky glowed faintly from distant fires. The men huddled in holes and barns, clutching their rifles for warmth. From a nearby trench, Corporal Eddie Carver Don's younger brother began to hum softly, a Christmas tune lost beneath the wind. Someone muttered, "Shut up," but no one really meant it. They were waiting for a miracle: supplies, reinforcements, anything. Instead, they got a message. General McAuliffe's reply to the German demand for surrender was passed along the line. To the German commander, nuts. The men laughed, tired and hollow, but it lifted them. They were holding. Somehow, they were holding. 2 days later, a German assault broke through the southern edge of the town. Mallory's squad was ordered to counterattack. The snowstorm had thickened visibility no more than 50 feet. The world was a blur of white and smoke. As they moved, Mallory could hear the Garands all around him, sharp cracks echoing like a heartbeat through the fog. He saw Carver ahead, crouched behind a wrecked jeep, exchanging fire with a squad of Germans moving through the smoke. "Flank 'em!" Carver yelled. Mallory nodded, slipped around the side, and saw his chance. He leveled his rifle, heart hammering, and fired. The first German dropped instantly. The second spun, reaching for cover too late. Mallory fired 6 shots in 4 seconds. Crack, 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 crack. The last man fell without a sound. When the smoke cleared, the squad advanced, stepping over frozen forms half buried in snow. Carver exhaled slowly. "That rifle of yours," he said. "If it could talk, it'd write the story of this war." Mallory looked down at it, frost-rimmed the barrel, smoke still rising from the muzzle. "Yeah," he said quietly, "and it'd say we're not done yet." That night, the sky finally roared, not with artillery, but with engines. Allied C-47 seconds appeared overhead, black crosses against the moon. Parachutes bloomed in the darkness, crates of ammunition, food, medicine. Mallory tore one open with numb fingers. Inside were bandages, rations, and cases of M1 ammo. He laughed, giddy with relief. "Santa came early," he said, tossing a clip to Carver. The sergeant caught it, grinning. "Then let's make every gift count." When Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines 3 days later, the defenders of Bastogne looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed, bearded. Their rifles held tight as if welded to their hands. An officer asked one of the survivors how they'd held so long. The man just smiled weakly and said, "Garand never froze. Neither did we." In Springfield, when word reached John Garand of Bastogne's defense, he reportedly stood for a long time in silence. His secretary later recalled him saying softly, "If my rifle helped those boys hold, then I've done my part." The M1 had proven its worth in every element: desert heat, hedgerow mud, and now Arctic cold. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of endurance. And as the winter turned, and the Allies began to push the Germans back toward their heartland, every man who carried one knew it had earned its title. The greatest battle implement ever devised. March 23. 1945 Remagen, Germany. A cold mist clung to the river valley like breath on glass. Across the Rhine, the outlines of ruined buildings flickered in the smoke. To the west, the Ludendorff Bridge loomed through the fog, scarred, broken, yet miraculously still standing. For the men of the U.S. 9th Armored Division, it was the unthinkable, a path into the heart of Germany itself. The bridge was wired with explosives. Machine gun nests lined the far shore, and artillery pounded the banks, but it was standing. Sergeant Don Carver stared through his binoculars, jaw tight. "They didn't blow it," he muttered. "God help us, they didn't blow it." Beside him, Private Joseph Mallory ran a gloved hand along his M1 Garand. The rifle was nearly 2 years old now, its walnut stock darkened from oil and sweat, the metal scarred but sound. He'd carried it across North Africa, through Normandy, into the Ardennes, and now, across the final frontier. "Orders?" Mallory asked. Carver nodded grimly. "We're going. The bridge holds, we take it. If it doesn't, well, you know." Mallory gave a crooked grin. "Then I guess we better run fast." At 1,300 hours, the first wave moved out. The wind off the river was sharp, filled with the tang of cordite and rust. German artillery thundered from the hills, shells bursting in the water like angry gods. Mallory's squad sprinted along the bank, rifles slung, boots splashing through mud. The steel bridge groaned under the weight of tanks and men. Every bolt, every beam seemed to tremble. Halfway across, the first machine gun opened up from the far bank. Rat-a-tat-tat. Bullets sparked against the girders. The men dove for cover behind steel braces. Mallory raised his Garand, fired once, twice, 3 times each shot clean, and measured despite the chaos. "Keep moving," Carver shouted. They surged forward again. The Garand's distinctive rhythm filled the bridge, hundreds of rifles firing in a rolling wave of sound. C-R-A-C-K, C-R-A-C-K, C-R-A-C-K echoes rippled off the steel like thunder in a canyon. A German soldier popped up behind a sandbag emplacement, Mauser in hand. Mallory dropped him with 2 quick shots. Another tried to set off the detonator charges along the bridge cables. Carver's bullet found him first. The air smelled of oil and ozone, hot steel and river mist. Smoke rolled in from the burning banks. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat, every pull of the trigger, every ping of an ejected clip ringing like a bell of fate. When they reached the far side, Carver turned, shouting into the din, "The bridge is ours." The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge sent shockwaves through the German high command. It was the first intact crossing of the Rhine, a psychological blow as deep as any physical defeat. American infantry and armor poured across within hours, expanding the bridgehead faster than the enemy could react. In Berlin, Hitler flew into a rage, ordering the execution of the officers responsible for the failure. But in the field, German soldiers facing the Americans could only stare in disbelief. The speed, the precision, the relentless rifle fire, it all came down to the same thing, the Garand. Captured enemy accounts later recorded. The Americans attack like water, always moving, always shooting. Their rifles do not stop. That night, in the ruined village beyond the bridge, Mallory sat against a stone wall, cleaning his rifle under the flicker of a burning house. The barrel still smelled of powder, the wood warm from use. Carver sat nearby, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. His face was pale beneath the soot. "They said crossing the Rhine would take a month," he said. "We did it in a day." Mallory smiled faintly. "Guess we didn't get the memo." Carver laughed, a low, tired sound. Then his gaze grew distant. "You ever think about what's next? After this?" Mallory shrugged. "After Germany?" "No," Carver said quietly. "After all of it. The war. What happens to men who forget how to stop fighting?" Mallory didn't answer right away. He looked down at the rifle in his lap, tracing the scratches and burns. Each one told a story: Tunisia, Normandy, Bastogne, Remagen. Finally, he said, "Maybe we don't stop. Maybe we just learn to carry it differently." By morning, the fog had lifted. Columns of American troops streamed east across the Rhine, their Garands slung over their shoulders, the sound of metal on webbing echoing like a march of ghosts. In the streets of nearby Erpel, villagers emerged from cellars, blinking at the sudden quiet. An old German farmer stood watching the endless line of soldiers pass. He muttered to his wife, "They carry rifles like no others. They shoot before you can even think." The woman nodded. Maybe that's why they're winning. Far to the west, at the Springfield Armory, the assembly line still roared. Women in grease-stained overalls worked double shifts, fitting gas cylinders, checking sights, stamping serial numbers. Pinned to the wall above the production floor was a newspaper clipping. U.S. troops cross Rhine at Remagen, using M1 Garands to cover advance. Someone had scrawled beneath it in pencil, "Our boys did it." John Garand himself stood in the observation gallery that morning, hands clasped behind his back. Below him, hundreds of new rifles gleamed under the factory lights, ready to ship overseas. He didn't smile. He only whispered, "May they bring this war to its end." In Germany, the war was unraveling fast. The Wehrmacht retreated toward the heartland, desperate and broken. Allied bombers filled the skies, tanks rolled through shattered cities, and in every ruined village, the crack of Garands echoed clean, rhythmic, unstoppable. For the German soldier, the sound had become more than a threat. It was the voice of inevitability, the sound of a war slipping away. As night fell again over Remagen, Mallory leaned his rifle against a wall and stared across the black water. The bridge was still standing, though damaged and groaning under its burden. Searchlights swept the far bank where German guns still fired sporadically. But the war, he could feel, it was nearly over. Carver approached quietly, a canteen in hand. "To the Rhine," he said, raising it. Mallory clinked his own against it. "And to this thing," he said, patting the Garand. "The one that got us here." They drank in silence, listening to the hum of the river and the distant thunder of artillery. Tomorrow, they'd march east, toward the heart of the Reich, toward the end. But tonight, for the first time, they believed that ending was truly possible, and resting beside them, gleaming in the firelight, was the rifle that had made it so. April 17. 1945, near Leipzig, Germany. The rain came down in cold gray sheets, turning the roads into rivers of mud. Columns of weary German prisoners trudged west, their rifles stacked in neat, useless piles. The once invincible Wehrmacht was broken. The Third Reich was collapsing on every front. For the men of Sergeant Don Carver's platoon, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. After 2 years of fighting, after North Africa, Normandy, Bastogne, and the Rhine, they were moving through a dying empire. Private Joseph Mallory walked in silence, his M1 Garand slung across his chest. The stock was scarred, the sling frayed, the metal burnished from constant use. He could tell its story by touch alone. Every gouge, every scratch, every mark was a memory. Ahead lay the shattered ruins of Leipzig, bombed-out factories, half-collapsed houses, and the smell of ash that clung to everything. German resistance was sporadic, now pockets of fanatics, snipers or boys with old rifles and no hope. But the danger was still real. "Keep your eyes up," Carver called. "Last thing we need is to die in the last damn week of the war." They reached a crossroads where a convoy of German trucks burned, the flames crackling through the rain. From the woods came a burst of rifle fire, sharp, fast, desperate. Bullets hissed past Mallory's head. "Contact, north tree line." The squad dove for cover. Mallory hit the mud, rolling behind a wrecked cart. He wiped the rain from his sights and spotted movement, 3 Germans, half hidden behind a hedgerow, firing wildly. He exhaled, aimed, and squeezed. Crack. A man dropped. He shifted slightly. Fired again, crack, crack. Another fell. The Garand bucked smoothly against his shoulder, the gas system cycling perfectly even through the grime. No hesitation, no jam. In seconds, the fight was over. The last German stumbled from the hedge, with his hands raised, eyes wide. He was barely 17. The boy's rifle, a worn Mauser 98K, dangled from his shoulder by a frayed strap. Mallory lowered his own weapon. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the boy said softly in accented English, "You always shoot so fast, like thunder." Mallory didn't answer. He just nodded, motioned for the boy to drop the rifle. The fight was over, at least for him. That night, the platoon bivouacked in the shell of an old textile mill. The wind whistled through broken windows, carrying the distant rumble of artillery. Mallory sat by the remains of a fire, wiping down his rifle with a piece of burlap. Carver joined him, sitting heavily, exhaustion etched into his face. "They say Berlin's surrounded," Carver murmured. "Won't be long now." Mallory nodded. "Feels strange, doesn't it? After all this time." Carver looked at him. "You ever think about home?" "Every day," Mallory said quietly. "But I don't think it's going to feel the same when I get there." He turned the rifle in his hands, watching the firelight dance along the metal. "This thing's been with me longer than most people I know. It's kept me alive when nothing else could. Hard to imagine putting it down." Carver smiled faintly. "Yeah, but someday we'll have to." Outside, the thunder of artillery rolled closer, not enemy fire, but the distant guns of the Red Army advancing from the east. The Allies were squeezing the Reich from both sides. Germany's end was only days away. 2 days later, they entered a village on the outskirts of Leipzig. The streets were eerily quiet. White sheets hung from windows, surrender flags, fluttering like ghosts. In the town square stood a statue of a German soldier, its head blown off by shrapnel. Beneath it lay abandoned weapons, piles of uniforms, and the remnants of a once disciplined army now dissolved into chaos. A local woman emerged from a cellar, clutching a small child. Her eyes were hollow, but she whispered, "It's over. Please, it's over." Carver lowered his rifle. "Ma'am, we're not here to hurt you." She looked at the weapon in his hands, the Garand, and nodded slowly, almost in reverence. "That sound," she said softly. "All winter we heard it. Ping, ping." We knew it meant the Americans were coming. Later that afternoon, orders came down. Hold position. No advance until further notice. Rumors spread: Hitler dead, Berlin burning, surrender near. Mallory sat outside what had once been a cafe, staring at the horizon. The air smelled of wet brick and diesel. In his lap lay the Garand, cleaned and ready, though there was no one left to fight. Carver joined him, carrying 2 tin cups of watery coffee. "You know," he said, "when this started, I thought that rifle was a mistake. Too heavy, too complicated. Now," he chuckled, "I wouldn't trade it for 100 Mausers." Mallory smiled. "Guess the Germans finally stopped laughing at our toy rifle." "Yeah," Carver said. "And we never stopped firing." They sat in silence, the war fading around them. The rifles that had defined so many battles now seemed strangely quiet, like old soldiers themselves, waiting for peace. That evening, the radio crackled to life. The message was short, almost subdued. "Allied High Command confirms German forces in Berlin have surrendered. Effective immediately, hostilities are to cease." No one cheered. No one moved. The words took time to sink in. Then, slowly, Mallory set his rifle down beside him and exhaled. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding it in readiness. For the first time, his hands were still. Carver raised his cup. "To the end," he said softly. Mallory nodded. "To the end, and to the Garand that got us here." They clinked their tin cups, the sound echoing faintly through the ruined streets. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The clouds parted just enough for a few pale stars to shine through, fragile, distant, and free. And in the corner of that quiet square, beneath the broken statue of a soldier, the M1 Garand rested against a wall, silent now, but undefeated. That night, Mallory dreamed of the rifle's familiar ping, the metallic voice that had followed him across continents. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was memory of courage, of loss, of survival. The war was over. But the sound of the Garand, that sharp, ringing note, would echo in the hearts of those who carried it for the rest of their lives. May 1945, Springfield, Massachusetts. The factory floor was quiet for the first time in years. The clang of hammers, the hum of machinery, the rhythmic beat of assembly lines all gone, replaced by silence. Dust motes drifted through the tall windows of the Springfield Armory, catching the soft morning light. Rows of M1 Garands gleamed under their final layer of oil, stacked in perfect formation like soldiers at parade rest. At the center of the hall stood John Cantius Garand, hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. His rifle had crossed oceans, liberated continents, and become a legend whispered by soldiers in muddy foxholes and frozen forests. Now the war was over, and his creation, the greatest battle implement ever devised, had done its work. A young worker approached, cap in hand. "Sir," he said softly, "they say the war's done. The boys are coming home." Garand nodded, eyes distant. "Yes," he murmured. "Let's hope they come home faster than the rifles did." He ran a hand over the smooth walnut stock of one rifle and whispered, "You've done your duty." June 1945, New York Harbor. The troop ships arrived one after another, their decks crowded with tired men in olive drab. Bands played, flags waved, and women wept with joy. Yet behind every smile was something quieter, a kind of disbelief. Sergeant Don Carver stepped off the gangplank, duffel slung over his shoulder. His M1 Garand, now officially turned in, felt like a phantom weight on his back. For years it had been part of him, a heartbeat, a shield, an extension of his will. Beside him, Private Joseph Mallory squinted at the skyline. The Statue of Liberty rose through the morning haze, green and ghostly. "Home," he said softly. Carver nodded. "Yeah, but it doesn't feel real." Mallory laughed quietly. "Maybe we just forgot how to be here." They walked down the pier in silence, passing other men, some limping, some missing limbs, all carrying invisible burdens. The sound of city traffic was deafening after years of war. And yet, amid the noise and life, something was missing: the steady crack of the rifle, the metallic ping that had followed them from Africa to Germany. Months later, Midwest farmland, Autumn 1945. Mallory stood on his father's porch, the fields stretching gold and endless before him. The war felt like another lifetime. His uniform hung in the closet, neatly pressed. But the habits remained, scanning the horizon, counting footsteps, always aware of cover and distance. He kept a photograph in his wallet. Him and Carver on the banks of the Rhine, both grinning, their Garands slung across their backs. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the cornstalks, he could almost hear it, the faint metallic ring of an ejected clip. It wasn't a sound of violence anymore. It was memory. He once told his father, "That rifle wasn't just a weapon. It was our lifeline. You trusted it like you'd trust another man." His father, a World War I veteran, nodded. "That's the kind of rifle that wins wars, the kind that makes it possible to come home." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., 1946, at a ceremony in the War Department, General George S. Patton's words were read aloud once more, the quote that would forever be tied to the M1 Garand. "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." Officers and engineers applauded. The statement was more than praise, it was recognition. The Garand had changed warfare. It had given ordinary soldiers the firepower to stand against the best-trained army in the world and win. Military analysts calculated that in skilled hands, a Garand could deliver over 40 accurate shots per minute, twice that of any enemy rifle. It had done so in mud, sand, snow, and ice. It had never been glamorous, never experimental, just reliable. And in war, reliability wins. 1949 Springfield Armory Museum. One rifle was placed in a glass case, serial number 1,000,000, engraved and polished. A small plaque read, "Presented to Mr. John C. Garand, inventor of the M1 rifle, which served the U.S. Armed Forces with distinction in World War II." Visitors often asked Garand how it felt to have created something that had changed the world. He always gave the same humble reply, "I just wanted it to work." When pressed, he'd smile faintly and say, "If the boys trusted it, that's all that matters." He died in 1974, never having patented his design for profit. His only payment was a government salary and the quiet knowledge that his work had helped end tyranny. Across the Atlantic Normandy, 1,950 seconds. The hedgerows had grown back, green and peaceful. Farmers tilled the same soil that once ran red. Occasionally, a boy would dig up a rusted helmet, a bullet casing, or, rarely, the remains of a Garand. Local museums displayed them reverently, their wood darkened by time, their metal still faintly shining. The plaques beneath them read simply, "The rifle that freed Europe, decades later, Arlington National Cemetery." A color guard of veterans stood at attention. Each man carried a Garand, now ceremonial, blued and polished, but still perfect. As the rifle volleys rang out over the fields of white headstones, the echo drifted like memory itself. Somewhere, a visitor looked up at the sound and said softly, "That's the sound of America." Back home, in a small-town museum in Indiana, an elderly Joseph Mallory stood before a display case. Inside rested a single M1 Garand, its serial number almost worn away. The placard beneath it read, "M1 Garand, issued 1942, carried across North Africa, Normandy, and Germany by Private Joseph Mallory, 1st Infantry Division. Donated 1,988. His hands trembled as he reached out, palm flat on the glass. For a moment, he was back there, the desert heat, the crash of waves on Omaha, the snow in Bastogne, the bridge at Remagen. He smiled faintly. "You never let me down," he whispered. Behind him, a group of schoolchildren gathered. One boy asked, "Mister, was that really your rifle?" Mallory turned, eyes soft. "Yeah," he said. "She was my best friend." The boy frowned. "But it's just a gun." Mallory shook his head gently. "No, son, it's history. It's the sound of freedom." Outside, the sun was setting, warm light spilling over the quiet streets of peace his generation had earned. He walked away slowly, leaving behind the rifle and the ghosts that had defined his youth. The M1 Garand remained, silent in its glass case, a piece of steel and wood that had once changed the world. And if you listened closely through time, through silence, you could almost hear it again. That crisp, perfect ping of a clip flying free.